Hello again, this is Dr. Reginald Yawnsworth, and tonight we're reluctantly examining humanity's greatest achievement in organized destruction World War I, where civilization looked at centuries of military tradition and said, you know what, let's industrialize murder and see how many people we can kill with modern efficiency. A story of magnificent incompetence, nationalist fervor, and the stunning human capacity to turn technological progress into systematic annihilation. So, settle in, perhaps check your gas mask if you have one, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Are you in Belgium, where entire cities were reduced to rubble for strategic advantages that never materialized? Or perhaps in Russia, where revolution seemed preferable to continuing a war that was killing more Russians than the enemy? Wherever you are, turn off those modern conveniences and let's stumble back to 1914 to witness humanity's first experiment in mechanized warfare on an industrial scale. Tonight's story isn't just about war, though there's certainly that. It's about how a civilization could embrace technology with such enthusiasm that it forgot to consider whether using that technology to kill millions of people was actually a good idea. It's about generals who treated human lives like chess pieces, politicians who promised glory and delivered only death, and the fascinating human ability to turn every technological advancement into a more efficient way to destroy each other. This is the story of the Great War. More devastating and more pointless than anything that came before, marked by the collapse of empires, the slaughter of an entire generation, and the rise of warfare as humanity's answer to the question, how can we make killing more efficient? It's about the moment when our ancestors decided that progress meant applying industrial methods to human destruction, and that maybe, just maybe, a really good war would solve all their political problems. Welcome to 1914, when Europe had spent decades building the most elaborate military alliance system in human history, and was about to discover that complex alliance networks combined with nationalism and modern weaponry create situations where one assassination can trigger global catastrophe. Congratulations, you've just woken up in a world where diplomacy has been replaced by mobilization schedules and political problems are solved through industrial-scale violence. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28th wasn't particularly shocking by the standards of European politics. Political figures were assassinated regularly, and most people expected this incident to be handled through normal diplomatic channels. What they hadn't anticipated was that Europe had created a system where every local conflict automatically became everyone else's problem through treaty obligations that turned minor disputes into continental wars. Austria-Hungary decided that Serbia needed to be punished for harboring the assassin, which seemed reasonable except that Russia had guaranteed Serbian independence, which meant that attacking Serbia meant fighting Russia, which meant that Germany would support Austria-Hungary because of their alliance, which meant that France would fight Germany because of their alliance, which meant that Britain would probably get involved because of their entente with France and their guarantee of Belgian neutrality. This alliance system had been designed to prevent war by making it too dangerous for anyone to start one, but it actually ensured that any war would immediately involve every major European power. It was like building a house out of dynamite and then being surprised when a small spark caused the entire structure to explode. The great powers had created a doomsday machine and then acted shocked when it activated itself. The July crisis escalated with mechanical precision as each nation mobilized according to predetermined plans that had been developed over decades. Military planners had created elaborate schedules for moving millions of soldiers and tons of equipment, and these schedules couldn't be stopped once they started without creating chaos that would leave nations defenseless against their enemies. Germany's Schlieffen Plan required attacking France through Belgium within days of mobilization, regardless of whether Germany actually wanted to fight France or Belgium. The plan was militarily brilliant and politically insane. It guaranteed that a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia would become a world war involving every major European power, plus their colonies, plus anyone unlucky enough to be allied with them. By August 1914, Europe had mobilized over 17 million soldiers who were enthusiastic about the war they were about to fight. Crowds cheered in Berlin, Paris, London, and Vienna as young men marched off to what everyone assumed would be a brief, glorious conflict that would be over by Christmas. The enthusiasm was genuine and universal. People genuinely believed that war would solve their political problems and strengthen their nations. The soldiers were equipped with the most advanced weapons in human history: magazine-fed rifles, machine guns, quick-firing artillery, and all the products of industrial civilization applied to military purposes. What they lacked was any understanding of how these weapons would perform in actual combat, or what kind of casualties they would produce when used against human beings in large numbers. Military leaders were still thinking in terms of 19th century warfare, involving cavalry charges, infantry assaults, and decisive battles that would settle conflicts quickly. They had modern weapons but ancient tactics, industrial firepower but pre-industrial strategy. The combination would prove catastrophic for everyone involved except the manufacturers of military equipment. The invasion of Belgium shocked the world because it violated international law and demonstrated that Germany was willing to ignore treaty obligations when they became inconvenient. Britain declared war primarily to uphold the principle that international agreements meant something, though many people weren't sure why defending Belgian neutrality was worth a world war. Within weeks, Europe had transformed from a continent of competing but peaceful nations into a military arena where millions of men were preparing to kill each other with scientific precision. The war that was supposed to solve political problems had instead created new problems that would require even more violence to resolve. The first battles of the war, the Battle of the Frontiers, the Battle of Tannenberg, the Battle of the Marne, involved casualties on a scale that no one had anticipated. Entire army corps were destroyed in single engagements, and casualty reports were so high that commanders initially refused to believe them. The weapons were working exactly as designed, which was the problem. The Western Front Horror Show, 1914 to 1917. Welcome to the Western Front, where military genius decided that the solution to being unable to advance against modern defensive weapons was to keep attacking with the same tactics, while hoping that eventually the laws of physics and human biology would bend to accommodate military strategy. The Western Front became a 450-mile laboratory for testing how many different ways modern technology could kill human beings. After the initial German advance was stopped at the Marne, both sides discovered that modern defensive weapons, machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery made offensive operations nearly impossible without suffering catastrophic casualties. The logical response would have been to reconsider military strategy and seek negotiated settlements. Instead, military leaders decided that they just weren't attacking hard enough. Trench systems developed rapidly as both sides dug into defensive positions that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. These weren't simple ditches but elaborate underground cities with multiple defensive lines, communication trenches, command bunkers, supply depots, and all the infrastructure necessary to support millions of soldiers living permanently in holes in the ground. Life in the trenches was worse than anything previous military experience had prepared soldiers for. Men lived in muddy ditches filled with human waste, decomposing bodies, rats the size of cats, and every disease that thrives in unsanitary conditions. The smell was so overwhelming that new soldiers vomited continuously until they adapted, and adaptation meant accepting that everything would smell like death forever. The space between opposing trenches, no man's land, was a hellscape of barbed wire, shell craters, poison gas, unexploded ordnance, and decomposing bodies that couldn't be recovered without risking additional casualties. No man's land could be anywhere from 50 yards to half a mile wide, but regardless of distance, crossing it under enemy fire was essentially suicide for anyone attempting the journey. Artillery bombardments preceded every offensive and were designed to destroy enemy defenses and kill defenders before infantry attacks began. These bombardments used thousands of guns firing millions of shells and could be heard hundreds of miles away. The noise was so intense that it caused permanent hearing damage and psychological trauma that persisted long after the war ended. Gas warfare was introduced as a solution to the stalemate, but quickly became another source of horror without providing military advantages. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas could kill or disable thousands of soldiers in minutes, but wind patterns were unpredictable. Gas masks provided some protection, and gas attacks often affected the attackers as much as the defenders. The Battle of Verdun, 1916, became a symbol of the war's futility as French and German forces fought for 10 months over territory that had no strategic value beyond its symbolic importance. The battle consumed 700,000 casualties for gains measured in hundreds of yards. Verdun demonstrated that modern warfare could continue indefinitely as long as nations were willing to feed soldiers into the killing machine. The Battle of the Somme, 1916, represented the British attempt to break the stalemate through superior numbers and firepower. The offensive began with a week-long artillery bombardment using 1.7 million shells, followed by attacks involving 120,000 soldiers. The first day produced 60,000 British casualties, including 20,000 deaths, the worst single day in British military history. New weapons were introduced regularly as both sides sought technological solutions to tactical problems. Flamethrowers, poison gas, tanks, aircraft, and increasingly sophisticated artillery all made their debuts on the Western Front. Each new weapon was supposed to provide the decisive advantage that would end the stalemate, but instead they just added new varieties of death to an already horrific situation. The British developed tanks as a way to cross no man's land while providing protection from machine gun fire. Early tanks were mechanical disasters that broke down constantly, moved at walking speed, and often killed their crews through carbon monoxide poisoning or mechanical failures. But they worked well enough to suggest that armored vehicles might eventually solve the mobility problem. Aircraft evolved from reconnaissance tools to fighters to bombers, as both sides sought to gain advantages through air power. Air combat became glamorous and romantic in popular imagination, but pilots died at rates that made infantry service look safe. Most combat pilots survived only a few weeks, and mechanical failures killed as many airmen as enemy action. Medical advances were accelerated by the war's casualty rates, but medical facilities were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of wounded soldiers requiring treatment. Field hospitals developed techniques for treating traumatic injuries, performing amputations, and dealing with poison gas exposure. But many wounded soldiers died from infections, blood loss, or shock before they could receive proper medical care. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was recognized as a serious medical condition affecting thousands of soldiers who couldn't cope with the psychological trauma of modern warfare. Military authorities initially treated shell shock as cowardice or malingering, but the condition was so widespread that it couldn't be ignored or punished away. Chapter 3. The Eastern Front Collapse, 1914 to 1917. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war took on characteristics that made the Western Front look organized and civilized. The Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea across terrain that made logistics a nightmare and involved armies that were poorly equipped, inadequately supplied, and commanded by officers who treated soldiers like expendable ammunition. Russia entered the war with enthusiasm but little preparation for modern conflict. The Russian army was enormous but poorly equipped, poorly trained, and poorly led. Russian soldiers often fought without adequate weapons, ammunition, or medical supplies, and casualty rates were so high that entire units were replaced multiple times during single campaigns. The Battle of Tannenberg, 1914, demonstrated Russian military incompetence when two Russian armies managed to destroy each other while fighting a smaller German force. Poor communication, inadequate maps, and incompetent leadership resulted in the complete destruction of the Russian Second Army and casualties that shocked even experienced military observers. Austria-Hungary discovered that its multi-ethnic empire wasn't particularly enthusiastic about fighting a war to preserve Habsburg rule. Slavic units deserted or surrendered to Russian forces, while German and Hungarian units found themselves fighting not just external enemies, but internal rebellion. The Austro-Hungarian army was falling apart from within while being destroyed from without. Supply problems on the Eastern Front were catastrophic because the infrastructure couldn't support the movement of millions of soldiers and their equipment across vast distances. Russian soldiers often fought without proper winter clothing, adequate food, or sufficient ammunition. Armies left trails of frozen corpses as they retreated across landscapes that provided no shelter or resources. The Brusilov Offensive, 1916, was Russia's most successful military operation and demonstrated that proper planning and adequate resources could produce victories even in modern warfare. The offensive initially succeeded in destroying several Austro-Hungarian armies and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, but Russian forces couldn't sustain the advance due to supply problems and German reinforcements. Revolutionary sentiment spread through Russian armies as soldiers began questioning why they were dying for a government that couldn't provide them with basic necessities. Military discipline collapsed as soldiers realized that their officers were incompetent and their government was indifferent to their suffering. Entire units began deserting or refusing orders. The February Revolution, 1917, overthrew the Tsarist government but didn't solve Russia's military problems. The provisional government continued fighting the war despite having no popular support and no resources to continue military operations. Soldiers and civilians demanded peace, but the government insisted on honoring alliance obligations to Britain and France. The October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power with promises to end Russia's participation in the war. Lenin understood that the war was destroying Russian society and that peace was necessary for the survival of the revolutionary government. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 1918, ended Russian participation in the war, but at enormous territorial cost. Russia's withdrawal from the war allowed Germany to transfer troops from the Eastern to Western Front, but by 1918, Germany was too exhausted to take advantage of this opportunity. The war had consumed so many resources and caused so much social disruption that even military victories couldn't restore German strength. The Eastern Front demonstrated that modern warfare could destroy entire societies, not just armies. The collapse of the Russian Empire, the disintegration of Austria-Hungary, and the emergence of new nations from the wreckage showed that the war's consequences extended far beyond military casualties to include the destruction of political systems that had existed for centuries. Chapter 4. The War at Sea and in the Air. The war extended beyond land battles to include the first systematic attempts to use naval and air power as decisive strategic weapons. Both sides discovered that new technologies could extend warfare to previously safe areas, making civilians legitimate targets and transforming entire societies into military targets. The British naval blockade of Germany was designed to starve the German population into submission by preventing food and raw materials from reaching German ports. The blockade was effective, but violated international law regarding neutral shipping and civilian targets. It demonstrated that modern warfare would necessarily involve attacks on civilian populations. Germany responded with unrestricted submarine warfare designed to starve Britain by sinking merchant ships carrying food and supplies to British ports. German U-boats could sink ships faster than they could be replaced, but submarine attacks on neutral shipping, particularly American vessels, created diplomatic problems that eventually brought the United States into the war. The sinking of the Lusitania, 1915, shocked American public opinion and demonstrated that passenger ships were not safe from military attack. The ship was carrying civilian passengers, but also military supplies, which made it a legitimate military target under German interpretation of international law, but a war crime under British and American interpretation. Naval battles like Jutland, 1916, involved hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors, but produced inconclusive results that didn't change the strategic situation. The German High Seas Fleet was powerful enough to challenge British naval supremacy, but not powerful enough to break the British blockade or achieve decisive victory. Aircraft were initially used for reconnaissance but quickly evolved into fighters, bombers, and ground attack aircraft, as both sides recognized the military potential of air power. Air combat was glamorous in popular imagination but deadly in reality. Most combat pilots died within weeks of arriving at the front. Strategic bombing began during World War I as both sides attempted to attack enemy industrial facilities and civilian morale through air raids. Zeppelin raids on London killed hundreds of civilians and demonstrated that air power could bring warfare to areas that were previously safe from military attack. The development of fighter aircraft was accelerated by the need to gain air superiority over battlefields and protect ground forces from enemy air attacks. Aircraft design improved rapidly during the war as engineers learned how to build faster, more maneuverable, and more heavily armed aircraft. Air warfare was limited by the primitive nature of early aircraft, which were unreliable, short-ranged, and vulnerable to weather conditions. Most aircraft were lost to mechanical failures rather than enemy action, and pilot training was so inadequate that many airmen died in training accidents before seeing combat. The psychological impact of air raids on civilian populations was greater than their military effectiveness. Air attacks on cities created panic and demonstrated that modern warfare would necessarily involve attacks on civilian targets. The distinction between military and civilian targets was beginning to blur. Chapter 5. America enters the fray, 1917 to 1918. The United States spent 3 years trying to avoid involvement in European conflicts while trading with all sides and gradually becoming more committed to Allied victory. American entry into the war in April 1917 was presented as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy, but it was actually the result of German submarine attacks on American shipping and economic ties to Allied governments. President Wilson had campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But by 1917, American neutrality had become impossible to maintain. German submarine warfare was sinking American ships. German diplomats were attempting to form an alliance with Mexico against the United States, and American loans to Allied governments created financial incentives for American involvement. The Zimmermann telegram revealed German attempts to convince Mexico to attack the United States in exchange for the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The telegram was intercepted by British intelligence and shared with American authorities as evidence of German hostile intentions toward the United States. American public opinion shifted dramatically toward supporting war against Germany. American military preparation was inadequate for modern warfare because the United States had avoided involvement in European conflicts and maintained only a small professional army. The draft was instituted to raise an army of millions, but American soldiers were poorly trained and equipped when they first arrived in Europe. The American Expeditionary Force under General John J. Pershing insisted on fighting as an independent American army rather than providing replacements for exhausted British and French units. This decision delayed American involvement in major battles but ensured that American forces would gain combat experience and maintain national identity. American industrial capacity was crucial to Allied victory because American factories could produce weapons, ammunition, and supplies without being subject to enemy attack. American agriculture fed Allied populations, American banks financed Allied governments, and American shipping replaced vessels sunk by German submarines. The arrival of American troops provided psychological benefits to exhausted Allied forces and demonstrated to German leaders that they were now fighting not just European powers, but the industrial capacity of the United States. German military leaders realized that they needed to achieve victory quickly before American forces could be fully deployed. American casualties were relatively light compared to European losses because American forces arrived late in the war and participated in fewer major battles. However, American soldiers experienced the same conditions as their European allies and died from the same causes: machine gun fire, artillery bombardments, poison gas, and disease. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 killed more American soldiers than combat, demonstrating that disease remained a major military threat, even with modern medical knowledge. The pandemic spread rapidly through military camps and transport ships, killing millions of people worldwide and weakening all armies regardless of nationality. American involvement decisively shifted the balance of power on the Western Front because German forces were exhausted after 4 years of warfare, while American forces were fresh and well supplied. The combination of American troops, American supplies, and American financial support made German victory impossible. Chapter 6. The Final Offensive and Collapse. 18. By 1918, all combatant nations were approaching the limits of their capacity to continue the war. Military casualties had consumed an entire generation of young men, civilian populations were starving due to economic disruption and naval blockades, and governments were struggling to maintain popular support for conflicts that seemed to have no purpose beyond continuing the killing. Germany's Spring Offensive, 1918, was a desperate attempt to achieve victory before American forces could be fully deployed. German forces had been reinforced by troops transferred from the Eastern Front after Russia's withdrawal, but these troops were exhausted, poorly supplied, and fighting for a government that was losing popular support. The German offensive initially succeeded in breaking through Allied lines and advancing toward Paris, but German forces couldn't sustain the advance due to supply problems and Allied counterattacks. The offensive consumed Germany's last reserves and left German forces vulnerable to Allied counter-offensives. The 100 Days Offensive demonstrated that the stalemate could be broken through coordinated attacks using combined arms tactics involving infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. Allied forces finally learned how to use modern weapons effectively, but only after 4 years of catastrophic casualties and failed offensives. German military leaders realized that victory was impossible and began seeking negotiated peace before Germany was completely destroyed. The German army was disintegrating through desertion and revolutionary activity, while the German home front was collapsing due to starvation and war exhaustion. The armistice negotiations required Germany to accept terms that were essentially unconditional surrender disguised as negotiated peace. Germany was required to withdraw from occupied territories, surrender military equipment, and accept Allied occupation of German territory. The armistice terms made German recovery impossible and guaranteed future conflicts. The collapse of the Central Powers was rapid and complete once military defeat became inevitable. Austria-Hungary disintegrated into separate nations as ethnic groups declared independence. The German Empire collapsed as revolutionary movements overthrew the government and established a republic. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered by Allied forces and Arab nationalist movements. The war ended on November 11, 1918, not through decisive military victory, but through exhaustion and collapse. All combatant nations were economically ruined, politically unstable, and socially traumatized by 4 years of unprecedented violence. The war that was supposed to solve political problems had instead created new problems that would require decades to resolve. Casualty figures were so high that they were initially disbelieved by populations that had been told the war would be brief and glorious. Military deaths exceeded 8 million, civilian deaths exceeded 6 million, and wounded soldiers numbered in the tens of millions. Entire nations had been transformed into graveyards. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 killed more people than the war itself, demonstrating that modern transportation systems could spread disease as efficiently as they could spread armies. The pandemic killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide and showed that globalization could be as dangerous as it was beneficial. Chapter 7. The Peace to End All Peace, 1919 to 1923. The Paris Peace Conference was supposed to create a new international order that would prevent future wars through democratic governments, national self-determination, and international cooperation. Instead, it created a peace settlement that satisfied no one and guaranteed future conflicts by imposing impossible conditions on defeated nations while ignoring the concerns of populations that had fought the war. The Treaty of Versailles imposed enormous financial reparations on Germany that were designed to prevent German recovery and ensure French security. The reparations were economically impossible to pay and politically impossible to accept, creating resentment that would fuel future conflicts. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for causing the war and pay for damages that exceeded German capacity to pay. The territorial provisions of the peace settlement created new nations that were economically unviable and ethnically diverse. Poland, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were created by combining different ethnic groups that had no desire to live together under single governments. These new nations were guaranteed to experience internal conflicts and external interventions. The German military was limited to 100,000 men and prohibited from possessing tanks, aircraft, or submarines. These restrictions were unenforceable and encouraged German military leaders to evade the peace terms through secret rearmament and cooperation with the Soviet Union. Military restrictions without political reconciliation guaranteed future conflicts. The mandate system gave Allied powers control over former German colonies and Ottoman territories under the pretense of preparing these areas for independence. In practice, the mandate system was colonialism disguised as international cooperation, and mandate territories became sources of future conflicts as native populations demanded genuine independence. The League of Nations was created to provide collective security and prevent future wars, but it lacked enforcement mechanisms and excluded defeated nations and revolutionary governments. The United States refused to join the League, making it impossible for the organization to fulfill its intended functions. The League became a talking shop rather than an effective international organization. Russian exclusion from the peace settlement and non-recognition of the Bolshevik government created a revolutionary power that was committed to overthrowing the international order established by the peace treaties. Soviet Russia became a base for revolutionary movements worldwide and a potential ally for any nation that wanted to challenge the post-war settlement. Economic provisions of the peace settlement made European recovery impossible by creating trade barriers, currency instability, and reparations obligations that prevented normal economic relationships. The war had destroyed European economic integration, and the peace settlement prevented its restoration. Economic nationalism replaced economic cooperation. The peace settlement failed to address the social and psychological trauma caused by the war. Millions of veterans returned home with physical disabilities and psychological wounds that societies were unprepared to treat. The war had destroyed traditional social relationships and created expectations for social change that governments were reluctant to fulfill. War debts and reparations created financial instability that contributed to inflation, unemployment, and economic crisis throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Allied nations owed money to the United States, while Germany owed reparations to Allied nations. This circular debt structure made economic recovery impossible and created resentment among all parties. Chapter 8. The War's Legacy of Destruction. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but instead it was the opening act of a series of conflicts that would consume the 20th century and demonstrate that technological progress applied to military purposes could threaten the survival of human civilization. The war established patterns of industrial warfare, ideological conflict, and social destruction that would dominate international relations for decades. The social impact of the war was revolutionary in ways that political leaders had not anticipated. Traditional social hierarchies were destroyed by military casualties that eliminated entire social classes. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers and demanded political rights that had been denied before the war. Class relationships were transformed by shared wartime experiences and economic changes. Medical advances were accelerated by the war's casualty rates, leading to improved techniques for treating traumatic injuries, performing surgery, and developing prosthetic devices. However, these medical advances were accompanied by new understanding of psychological trauma that societies were unprepared to address. Shell shock became a permanent feature of post-war society. Technological development was permanently militarized by the war's demonstration that scientific research could provide decisive military advantages. Chemical weapons, aircraft, tanks, submarines, and radio communications all advanced rapidly during the war and continued to be developed for military purposes afterward. The boundary between civilian and military technology disappeared. The war accelerated the decline of European global dominance by demonstrating that European nations could destroy each other more effectively than they could dominate other regions. European empires were weakened by war casualties and economic disruption, while non-European nations gained confidence and independence movements gained strength. Revolutionary movements worldwide were encouraged by the war's demonstration that existing governments could be overthrown through violence, and that social transformation was possible. The Russian Revolution inspired communist movements worldwide, while national liberation movements in colonized territories gained strength from European weakness. The war created a generation of veterans who had experienced violence on an unprecedented scale and who were trained in the use of modern weapons. These veterans formed the core of paramilitary organizations, revolutionary movements, and extremist political parties that would dominate European politics during the interwar period. Economic consequences of the war included inflation, unemployment, currency instability, and trade disruption that persisted throughout the 1920s and contributed to the Great Depression of the 1930s. The war had demonstrated that modern economies could be mobilized for total war, but it had also shown that such mobilization could destroy the economic foundations of society. The peace settlement created conditions that made future conflicts inevitable by imposing impossible conditions on defeated nations while failing to address the underlying causes of international conflict. German resentment of the Versailles Treaty provided political opportunities for extremist movements that promised to overturn the post-war settlement through violence. Chapter 9. Cultural and Psychological Impact. The cultural impact of World War I was as profound as its political consequences, transforming art, literature, philosophy, and social relationships in ways that reflected the war's demonstration that civilization was far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The war destroyed 19th century optimism about progress and human nature while creating new forms of cultural expression that reflected traumatic experience. Literature was transformed by writers who had experienced combat and could describe the reality of modern warfare in ways that revealed the gap between official propaganda and soldiers' actual experiences. Authors like Erich Maria Remarque, Siegfried Sassoon, and Wilfred Owen created new forms of war literature that emphasized suffering rather than glory. Art movements like Dadaism and Expressionism emerged as artists sought new ways to represent experiences that traditional artistic techniques couldn't capture. The war had demonstrated that rational approaches to human problems could produce irrational results, and artists responded by abandoning rational artistic techniques in favor of experimental approaches that reflected psychological fragmentation. Philosophy was permanently changed by the war's demonstration that technological progress could be used for destructive rather than beneficial purposes. Philosophers like Oswald Spengler predicted the decline of Western civilization, while others like Karl Barth emphasized human sinfulness and the limitations of human reason. Optimistic philosophies of progress were replaced by pessimistic analyses of human nature. Religion was challenged by the war's casualties and the apparent failure of Christian nations to behave according to Christian principles. Many people lost faith in traditional religious explanations for suffering, while others turned to new religious movements that promised to explain why God had allowed such unprecedented destruction. Traditional Christianity never fully recovered its pre-war authority. Gender relationships were transformed by women's participation in war work and their demands for political equality. The war demonstrated that women could perform tasks that had been considered exclusively male, while military casualties created demographic imbalances that changed marriage patterns and family structures. Traditional gender roles were permanently disrupted. Class relationships were transformed by shared wartime experiences that broke down traditional social barriers while creating new forms of solidarity based on common suffering rather than social position. The war created a generation of veterans who had more in common with each other than with civilians of their own social class. Popular culture was permanently changed by the war's demonstration that official propaganda could not be trusted, and that individual experience was more reliable than institutional authority. Cynicism about government, military leaders, and established institutions became characteristic of post-war culture and was reflected in music, literature, and popular entertainment. Education was transformed by the recognition that traditional approaches to teaching history, politics, and international relations had failed to prevent catastrophic conflicts. New approaches to education emphasized critical thinking rather than memorization, while new academic disciplines like international relations emerged to study the causes of war and the conditions for peace. Chapter 10: The War That Changed Everything. So there you have it, World War I, where humanity discovered that technological progress combined with political stupidity could produce results that made previous disasters look like minor inconveniences. This was supposed to be the war that would make the world safe for democracy, but it turned out that making the world safe required destroying most of it first. The Great War represents humanity's first experiment in total war, where entire societies were mobilized for military purposes and civilian populations became legitimate military targets. The result was a conflict that consumed resources on an unprecedented scale while producing political results that satisfied no one and guaranteed future conflicts. What's remarkable about World War I is not that it happened. European tensions had been building for decades, and some form of conflict was probably inevitable. What's remarkable is that rational, educated leaders could convince themselves that modern weapons would make warfare more decisive rather than more destructive, and that political problems could be solved through military victories. The war demonstrated that technological progress without moral progress leads to increasingly efficient methods of destruction rather than human improvement. Every technological advancement, from chemical weapons to aircraft to improved artillery, was immediately applied to military purposes and used to kill people more efficiently. But the war also demonstrated human capacity for survival, adaptation, and recovery under conditions that would have been considered impossible before 1914. Soldiers learned to live in trenches that were worse than medieval prisons. Civilians learned to survive under conditions of total war that targeted entire populations rather than just military forces. The war created new forms of international cooperation through shared suffering and common recognition that such conflicts must never be repeated. The League of Nations failed, but it established principles of international organization that would eventually lead to more successful efforts at international cooperation. The idea that nations could cooperate to prevent war survived even when specific institutions failed. Medical and technological advances accelerated by wartime needs provided benefits that outlasted the conflict. Techniques for treating traumatic injuries, performing surgery, and manufacturing consumer goods were all advanced by wartime requirements. The war was destructive, but it also accelerated beneficial developments that improved civilian life. Social changes produced by the war, including women's suffrage, workers' rights, and challenges to traditional authority, represented genuine progress toward more democratic and egalitarian societies. The war destroyed traditional hierarchies that had prevented social progress, even though it also created new problems that required decades to resolve. The war's demonstration that modern conflicts could destroy entire civilizations led to serious efforts to understand the causes of war and develop methods for preventing future conflicts. International relations became an academic discipline, peace movements gained popular support, and diplomatic techniques were refined to provide alternatives to military solutions. We remember World War I not just as a catastrophic military conflict, but as the moment when humanity realized that our technological capabilities had exceeded our wisdom in using them responsibly. The war was a warning about the dangers of nationalism, militarism, and the application of industrial methods to human destruction. Today we face similar challenges with nuclear weapons, climate change, and global economic integration that create possibilities for both unprecedented cooperation and unprecedented destruction, just as industrialization created possibilities for both progress and catastrophic warfare in the early 20th century. The Great War reminds us that human beings are capable of both remarkable stupidity and remarkable resilience, that technological progress requires moral progress to be beneficial, and that international cooperation is necessary for survival in a world where local conflicts can have global consequences. But perhaps most importantly, World War I teaches us that civilizations can recover from even the most catastrophic failures of leadership and common sense. The war was horrible, but it ended. The peace settlement was flawed, but it was eventually replaced by better arrangements. Human beings learned from their mistakes, even when those mistakes cost millions of lives. The Great War was not the war to end all wars, but it was the war that taught us why wars must be ended before they destroy everything we claim to be fighting to preserve. That lesson came at a terrible price, but it was learned, and it continues to influence how we think about international relations, conflict resolution, and the proper relationship between technological capability and moral responsibility. In the end, World War I was humanity's most expensive education in the dangers of modern warfare and the necessity of international cooperation. We're still working on applying that education today, but we're working on it because people who lived through the Great War refused to accept that such catastrophes were inevitable or acceptable. The Great War ended not with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion and recognition that such conflicts must never be repeated. That recognition led to efforts at international cooperation that eventually succeeded in preventing similar conflicts, even when specific institutions failed and specific leaders made terrible mistakes. So here's to the Great War, humanity's most expensive lesson in the dangers of applying industrial efficiency to human destruction, written in blood and mud, and the stubborn human refusal to accept that civilization must necessarily destroy itself through military conflict. And you know what we learned? It took another world war and decades of near-catastrophic mistakes, but we eventually learned that international cooperation is preferable to international destruction, that problems are better solved through negotiation than through artillery bombardments, and that technological progress requires moral progress to be truly beneficial. We're still working on that project today. Every time we choose diplomacy over warfare, cooperation over competition, and peaceful resolution over violent conflict, we're continuing the work that began when people realized that the Great War must never be repeated. The Great War was great not because it was glorious, but because it was so horrible that it forced humanity to find better ways of resolving conflicts. That's not much consolation for the millions who died, but it's something. The war that was supposed to end all wars didn't end war, but it did end the illusion that war was glorious, that technology would make conflicts brief and decisive, and that civilized nations could settle their differences through organized violence without destroying everything they claimed to be defending. World War I was humanity's first encounter with the reality that modern technology could be used to destroy civilization as easily as it could be used to advance it. The lesson was expensive, costing millions of lives and destroying centuries of accumulated wealth and knowledge, but it was learned. We stand today on foundations built by people who survived the Great War and dedicated their lives to ensuring that such catastrophes would never be repeated. Every international organization, every treaty limiting weapons of mass destruction, every effort at peaceful conflict resolution exists because people who lived through 1914 to 1918 understood that the alternative to international cooperation was international annihilation. The Great War ended with the recognition that in modern warfare there are no winners, only survivors who must rebuild what the war destroyed while hoping they've learned enough to prevent future disasters. It was humanity's most expensive education, but it was education nonetheless. Today we face different challenges: climate change, nuclear weapons, global pandemics, and economic inequality that could produce conflicts as destructive as anything the Great War generated. But we face these challenges with knowledge gained from the Great War about the importance of international cooperation, the dangers of nationalism and militarism, and the necessity of solving problems before they escalate to violence. The Great War taught us that human beings are capable of remarkable destructiveness when they organize their technological capabilities for military purposes, but also that they're capable of remarkable creativity when they organize those same capabilities for peaceful purposes. The choice between destruction and construction is still ours to make. So there we have it. Another cheerful bedtime story from history's greatest hits collection. Sleep well, knowing that while your ancestors survived all of this somehow, you get to complain about social media arguments and traffic jams instead of poison gas and artillery bombardments. Progress is real, even if it's messier and more fragile than we'd like. The Great War is over. We made it through and we're still here, still learning, still trying to make things better. That has to count for something. Sweet dreams, and remember, when you wake up tomorrow in a world where international conflicts are settled through diplomacy rather than artillery, you're living in the future that Great War survivors worked to create. It's not perfect, but it's better than